Welcome to the Coding Loft. My name is Samuel and today we look at a small fun project where you will learn how to build a reusable slider in React. Right here you have a slider consisting of several images. You have the previous and the next button, and then you can click them to switch between different slides, and once you reach the maximum number of slides you go back to the first one. And it works of course in both directions. So we're not going to use any pre-built slider package, but instead we will build our own slider logic, and we will also use Tailwind because it works really well with React. So let's jump right in. To get started, you will need Node.js and npm installed. Make sure you have those. And in this video, we will use Vite to create our React app. And we will do that by saying npm create Vite at latest. And then you have to give it the name of your project. In our case, we just call it React Slider, but you can name it whatever you want. It will ask you for the template. So we'll say React. We will use JavaScript for now. And now it has created a project. You can see that we can go inside the project by saying cd React Slider. Now we're inside the project and we can install all of the dependencies by saying npm install. And after a short moment, everything is installed. Now we can open this up in VS Code and then we can run our development server. So to start it, we say npm run dev. So at this address down here, I can now see my React project. So now it's time for installing Tailwind. So head over to the Tailwind documentation. Link is in the video below. And they have a really great documentation about pretty much everything you can do with Tailwind. So here's about the installation of React and Vite. And as you can see, that's what we just did, this command right here. So now we need to install Tailwind. So let's just copy this code right here and paste it in the terminal. And then we can configure the template path. So simply by going to tailwind config.js. So in the content section, we just specify the paths where we can use Tailwind. So let's just replace the content part here, save it, and add all of these 3 lines here into the file called index.css. You will find it in the source folder. So let's delete all of that. We don't need it for now, and paste it in. Now our development server is already running. So let's quit that and let's start it again. So now we say npm run dev. And you can see that the layout has completely changed because now Tailwind is active and we've also removed the basic CSS from before. Let's continue by removing all of that stuff we don't need. So everything here inside of this div container, we can basically just throw out. Also up here, delete it. And we don't need this useState up here either. We can also delete all of that here. Inside of the assets folder, let's just remove react.svg. And instead we will add our images inside this assets folder. So I have this folder with 5 different images and you can find them in the Github Repo, but of course you can use your own images as well. So let's drag them in there. Now we have 5 images inside of this assets folder and we can import them now in our app component. So let's say import images and then we import them one by one. So import hills from, and then you specify the file path, assets/hills.jpg, and now you repeat it with the other images as well. Now the way that images in React work is that you have to import them first as an object and then you can use them in your application. So you don't specify inside the application the path to this assets folder, but instead you import them up here and then you can use them in the application. So inside here we will create an images array called images, and it's an array of these 5 images. All we have to do now is say hills, mountain lake, seaside, what are the other ones? Stream and valley. And now we have an array consisting of these 5 images. And the reason why we put them into an array, we want to pass them into our slider component as a prop, because that way we can reuse the slider inside of our app with different images. Now the next step is to create a slider component. So say slider, and I already told you that we will accept these images as a prop. So we will pass them down inside of our component and remove app.css up here and add a small typo up here. So make sure that you have the correct name. So it's mountain lake with a dash. And as you can see, nothing is happening, of course, because we don't have a slider component yet. So let's create it. So we will create a new folder called components. And in here we will create a slider component, slider.jsx. Now I have this extension called Simple React Snippets. Make sure you install it, because what you can now do is, once you're inside of the component, you just press FFC and it creates a basic functional component layout. So now we have the name slider that we pass in, and in here we have something which will be our slider component later. For now, let's just say my slider. And we still don't see anything yet because, as you can see right here, reference error slider is not defined. Inside of our app component, we first need to import it. So let's import our components. You don't need to make these comments, but I just find it more readable for later, especially if you have more complex apps. So import slider and just click here and it will autofill everything. And now you have imported the slider component. Now you can see that my slider is what we passed in down here. And you can also see that we've passed in this images array. So in order to use it in our component, we need to accept it here as a prop. And the way that we do it is with an object destructuring. So we just say images. That's the name we gave it. Now we also want to give our slider a title. So for now I will say our nature trips. And again, we need to accept this as a prop here. So we say title like that. And that's all we had to do inside of our app component. Now let's just delete this up here. We don't need it. And let's just create our basic HTML layout. So we have a div and we give it an ID of slider. We actually don't need this ID in our use case right now, but it's just for readability. And it makes it clearer where everything is in our application. So class name we will also specify in a second. And we start with the title prop. So that will be the title property that we passed in. So title. Our nature trips, you can see that it's now here on our screen. And below that we want to, first of all, check whether the array is actually there. So if there are no images, we don't want to show anything. Or we can show an error message or something like that, but we don't want to show the slider component. So if images exist, then something should happen. So we do that simply by saying images. So when images exist, and we have this double ampersand, which evaluates this condition. So the condition in this case is images should exist. It should not be undefined, null, or empty. And if that's the case, then everything behind the ampersand will run. So in our case, that will be a div. And that will be class name. We give it slider container. Again, we don't need a class name right now for our use case, but it just makes it more readable to understand where everything is. So here we have the whole slider and here we have the slider container. And inside of our slider container, we want an image because the slider container will wrap our image. And then below we will have our buttons, which will be an A tag with a class name of button brief and button next. Again, just for readability. And now you can see that React is actually throwing an error because we have this div and this anchor tag, because after a conditional rendering, as we have right here, we just need one element. So that's why we will create a fragment and then we put everything inside there, okay? And now you can see the error is gone. And below we have another anchor tag with a class name of button next. And we will pass in a smaller and greater signs. And the way that we do that is saying ampersand less than semicolon, and down here we say ampersand greater than semicolon. And now we have these two signs, less than and greater than. Let's pass in an image as a source. And for now, this is just for demonstrational purposes because we will select a specific image later, but we just want to show one image. But first, let's finish the styling and then we will jump to the logic of the slider. So we start with this div with the ID of slider, so with the class name. What do we want to do? Well, first we want a flex box because we can then align the items, and we want flex column because that will align them top to bottom. Now we say items center and justify center. And everything is now aligned in the middle, as you can see. We also want a light red background. You can choose any color you like, but I always like to see inside of our project where the slider starts and where it ends. And to make the view more readable, you can press Alt-Z, and then it will wrap to the size of your window in VS Code. Now you can find all of these class names inside of the Tailwind documentation. It has a fantastic documentation, so whenever you don't understand one thing, let's say item center, you can just look for it and then you will find where to use it and how it's applied. So anything that you are not sure of, you can simply look up here, for instance, the width of an element, and it will show you all of the different classes you can use to adjust the width of an element. Now let's add some padding simply by saying P-8, and we want it to fill the full screen. You can of course change it later. Let's change the look of our titles. So we want a large text, so we say text 2XL, as well as a different text color. So text slate 700 looks nice. And we want the font to be bold, so simply say font bold, and then margin bottom of 4. I just realized I made a small mistake. So what we will do is we will actually make a div out of this fragment. So let's say div up here and div down there. And we will give it a class name of slider container. This here will actually be slider image. And the reason is we want to position these two buttons absolute to this slider container. So the way that we do that is by saying relative here. And then for the buttons we say absolute. So let's continue with our slider containers. So as I said before, it's relative, and we also want again to use flex and flex column to align our items inside of it, because then we can very easily center them with item center and justify center. And now we can see that the buttons that we have defined up here, they're now exactly in the middle. We will change that in a moment, don't worry. Now let's make sure that it spans the full width of the screen. So width screen and height full, so that means a height of 100%. Let's continue with our buttons, because right now it looks very ugly the way that they are here in the middle. So we say up here, absolute. We want to position it on the left, so left 5. And we want to give it a background of white, a padding of 2, and make the corners rounded. But now you can see it's not really a circle, but more of an ellipsis. And the way that we change that is by giving it a specified width and height. So let's say width of 10 and a height of 10. And now it's exactly round. And you can also see the arrow is a little bit on the left. So we can simply change it by saying flex. So we make it flexbox, and then we justify to the center. Now we can simply copy that later part here, and we will paste it to our next button. But of course we need a different side, so we don't want it on the left side, but on the right. And maybe for larger screens we want to have it more on the right, so maybe left 10. So you can specify a min width property. So you say small, and everything above small will have a left 10 attribute. To check the exact number of pixels that small actually refers to, you simply can check the Tailwind documentation. So we do the same here. And then again, we also change it to right. So now when the screen is bigger, left 10 is applied, and below that left 5. Now it's time to change the way that our images look. So we want to fit them inside of our slider image container up here. And the way that we do that is that we set this slider image to a max width of screen medium, which if you check the documentation refers to a specific number of pixels. If you want to know what it is, so simply look at the documentation max width, and then you can say down here, max width screen medium means that you have a max width of 768 pixels. Now our regular width should be always a certain percentage, so that's 10/12. So by specifying the max width property, we just make sure that it never gets above that 768 pixels. We want rounded corners, which we don't see yet, but you will see in a second. If we add overflow hidden, now we have the rounded corners. That basically means that everything inside of that container cannot flow outside of it. So inside is just this image. We want a shadow XL, so we have a certain shadow down here, and then again have flex, justify center, and item center. Because we will also add in a height property, and for that we need the flex property. So 4/6 will be the height that we want, and you can change it, of course, as you can see. Now lastly, we need to add some classes to the image itself. So we say object cover. It will span the full height and the full width of our parent container, which is this div up here. And now it's time to create the actual logic, because if we click the buttons, nothing happens yet. So up here, let's define the JavaScript logic. So right now you can see that we just show this first slide, so the index 0, but we want this to be dynamic. So we create a state, which is called slide index, and then we also set slide index, and it equals use state. Once you hit enter, then it will automatically import use state up here. And in the beginning, this should be 0. So now down here, what we can do is we can switch this 0 by our slide index variable. And now you can see it's still the same image, because up here we said that the index is 0. If we change this to 1, you can see the other image, 2, 3. And that's basically the logic that we want to implement with our JavaScript. And the way that we do that is by creating another state variable, which is our active slide. So we always want to just show one slide, and that is our active slide. Again, we use the use state hook, and we will pass in our images with the current slide index. So it will always just take one image, which has the slide index that we have here. So right now it's 0. So now we can change the source in our image. We don't need images and then specify the slide index, but we'll just take the active slide. Now, how do we want to change those? Well, with these two buttons down here. So what we have to do is we have to specify a function and then call it once we click on that button. So we add in an onClick handler. Now we specify an onClick handler and we pass in an error function. So every time that we click this button on the left, we want to call a setSlider function and we want to change the index number by 1. And here it's the opposite. So we have onClick is an error function which we call, and then we also want to call our setSlider function, but instead of decreasing 1, we want to add 1. And that means we need to define our function up here. So setSlider is a function, and that slider function takes in a certain number. So now let's just see how this works. So we have a certain number, which we will log to the console, as well as our slide index. So now when we press the button here, you can see that the number that we pass in is -1 and the index up here is currently 0. And the same is true for the other one. So the number that we pass in is 1 and the index is 0. So now all we have to do is implement the logic that looks for the current slide index and then the number that we pass in. Now we just define a variable called new number and we say slide index plus our number. And then we want to set the slide index to the new number. And now you can see that once I press it, the index changes. And here we have already our first edge case that we need to take care of, because once our number is -1 and the index is 1, well, we can't take the index of -1 and -2 and -3 and so on, because it will just keep on going that way. So we want to set our slide index back to the last item of the images array. And the way that we do that is by saying if our slide index is currently 0 and the number equals -1, then we don't want to make the slide index more negative, but instead we want to set our slide index to the length of our images array, which in this case is 5 minus 1, because the index always starts at 0. And if the length of our images is 5, as it is right now, and we want to get the last image, then we need an index of 4. So we say images.length is 5 minus 4 equals 4. I forgot, make sure that you have 3 equal signs up here. Now what is the other edge case that we want to take care of? So if our slide index equals images.length minus 1, so in our case if it's 4, and if we press this button on the right, the number is 1, then we want to set the slide index back to 0. So let's see if that works. So now if I click, you can see that the index is exactly the way that we want. It's never higher than 5 and never below 0. And in the other direction, that's true too. The only problem is now that the images don't change. And the way that we do that is by using the useEffect hook. So the way that the useEffect hook works is we specify it down here, and it takes in a callback function, as well as an argument array that you can leave empty, or in our case, we want to pass something in. So every time something changes inside of our app, we want to call whatever function is inside of this useEffect callback function. In our case, we want to listen to the slide index variable. So every time slide index changes, then whatever is in here should also run. And what should happen? Well, we want to set the active slider, and we want to change it to our images array, and then we just want to pick the image that corresponds to the current slide index. So now you can see if I press the button on the left or the button on the right, our images change. One last thing to add is that when we hover over the button, we want to actually see a pointer as a cursor. So we say hover, and then we set the cursor to pointer. So now once we hover over it, we can actually see that we can press this button, and do the same down here. And maybe you also want the buttons to appear as if they're floating on top of the images. So just say shadow large and repeat the same down here. And now it just has a nicer visual effect. And that is how you create a very simple slider in React using Tailwind. And the cool thing about the slider is that, well, it's a separate component, so you can basically reuse it in different parts of your application. You can pass in other images and of course different props. Right now it's just the title, but you could also pass in, for instance, the background color of the slider that you want, or you could change the text color simply by passing in another prop up here and then referring to it down in your code. If you did like this video, please leave a like and a comment down below, and also let me know what other topics would you be interested to cover in the future. Then I will make sure to make videos about that too. Thanks for watching and see you in the next video.